Is America experiencing two different events right now? The first that took down the Roman Empire, and the second that took down the Roman Republic. We're going to dive into all that and more. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Jeremy Ryan Slate Show. I am your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, the CEO and co-founder of Command Your Brand. We help our clients to combat cancel culture by placing them on the right podcasts and new media. You can check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. Reminder, if you're brand new to this channel, like this video, leave us a comment and smash that subscribe button if you support liberty, freedom, and want to build a better future. All right, so today I wanted to get into a rather interesting topic, because if you've been following any of the media appearances I've been doing over the last, I don't know, since like February, so the last 4 or 5 months, I've been talking a lot about Rome's crisis of the 3rd century. Because if we look at what's happening in America, the crisis of the 3rd century is a pivotal situation in the Roman Empire, right? As we said, Rome is actually 3 eras in time: a kingdom first, then a republic, and then an empire. So when I've looked at it, I said, we're at a really late empire stage when you see a lot of these things happening. In the late 3rd century, Rome had a number of different problems. The first being an immigration problem from all the barbarians being brought into the country. You also had an inflation problem. By 284, they're at about 15,000% inflation. And those things made a lot of sense. Then a whole wrench got thrown into things. And that wrench would be the prosecution of President Donald Trump. And the interesting part about that is, if you look at that, it's how the Roman Republic fell. And it's really interesting, because if you look at it, it's almost like our political system and our economic system are aging differently. Because functionally, and I've talked to Alex Jones about this and other people about this as well, our republic is no longer a republic. It's some sort of a corporatocracy. And it's changed a lot since the progressive era is really kind of that time. So you're looking at the 1910s, 20s, 30s, in that era. A lot has changed, where America is not functionally a republic anymore. We're really an empire. But to the political class, they're still fighting out republic type squabbles, right? The powers. So it's a very, very interesting thing to understand. And I put together a really great thread on X, and this video, this video seeks to explain that thread, because it is rather complicated and complex. And I want to make this something understandable. But how can we be experiencing both things at once? And then when you look at that, what does each look like? So I want to explain that a little bit. And I'm going to go over long eras in time, compare them to now. I'm going to try my best to make it make sense without getting overly complex. If those of you out there are history people and get upset that I don't go into the entire social war with the Gracchi brothers, I'm sorry. We're going to use it as an explanation. There's other videos if you want that explanation, but this is more to help people understand the era and time we're in, and what it means for where we're at, and what can be done about it, right? I haven't 100% realized what can be done on the political front. I'm still working that out. On the economic front and on the immigration front, we've talked about that, right? We've talked about it a lot. And so I guess getting into it first and foremost, I'm going to be working off notes here. So I'm going to do my best to continue to be looking straight forward and looking right at you in order to working off my notes as well. But as I mentioned, Rome's 3rd century crisis, when Rome was an empire, is the thing that I've really seen to relate to what's happening now. Crumbling central power, inflation out of control, immigration problems. We have those things, right? Because inflation happened to fund a military. Well, what's happening here? Inflation is happening to fund a military, and our government continues to write checks that they can't cash. And the Western Empire lasts till 476. In the East, it lasts till 1453. But in the 200s, it really looked like the empire was going to fall due to a lot of these economic situations. That's why I'm saying, like, Handling our money is a really important issue. Handling immigration is a dire issue. If we don't handle these two things, this can collapse a country and collapse, in this case, an empire, if we're at that stage of things. Now, looking at the political class, because I think when people think of, they hear the words Roman Revolution. So the Roman Revolution was 133 to 31 BC. So we're like 400 years almost ahead of where I see us economically and where I see us in terms of immigration. Because remember, I've always talked about history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, right? A lot of the same things happen again because we get a lot of the same evil people making those mistakes. And also economics are in cycles and things like that run in cycles. So we're going to see a lot of similar issues. But looking at that time period, a lot changes that changes what is the Roman Republic. And the prosecution of Donald Trump fits in very well with this. It fits in remarkably well with this. So I guess I'm going to go through this and kind of put it in perspective. But as I mentioned, the Roman Civil War, and there's different parts to this, right? It's a long civil war, 133 to 31 BC. A lot happens in this time. And I guess when you compare it, this is where I was going with this. When you compare it to modern civil wars, it's often seen as, class warfare or class conflict or people versus the oligarchy or those in power. The Roman Civil War was different because what it was is it was the political classes fighting amongst each other. Because, even though Rome was a republic, it was very strange in the way that it voted. And I do want to do an episode on Roman voting in the future. But just to give you an idea, Rome is broken up into centuries. And these centuries also corresponded with the parts of the Roman army. But these were the different groups and different classes within Rome, and they had different votes. The lowest class, which is, more than half the population, has the lowest representation in voting. The moneyed classes, which make up most of the other centuries, are the higher representation. So really, it is only the rich classes and the wealthy classes that are part of this civil war. And it's often this person wants power or that person wants power or this person feels insulted. Dignitas or their dignity was a large reason a lot of politicians make the moves they make because they felt slighted. So the Roman Civil War is different than we would understand civil wars to be in our time. It's different. It's the political class fighting each other. And I think that's why it's so interesting when you look at it that way. So 133 to 31 BC is when this happens. Now, when we look at the actual sequence of things, in the beginning of this, around 133, there's two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, and they do a lot of land reforms, grain reforms, and the first brother, Tiberius Gracchus, I always mess up the order of these two. But the first brother, who's Tiberius Gracchus, he's a reformer. He's essentially a populist, and he wants to have land reforms and grain reforms. And it takes a long time, but these things really don't happen. And he meets a violent end as he's actually assassinated. So then his brother Gaius Gracchus comes in, and he's different than Tiberius. He's different in the way of he really does seem like he's someone that's using this as a thirst for power. So then Gaius Gracchus, again, there's voting issues, irregularities, and it leads to upheaval in Rome to the point of he basically commits suicide. It's a very strange situation. But anyway, this is really the beginning of the upheaval. And it's upheaval because there's actually armed bands going against each other in the forum. This is not how Roman politics functions. Roman politics is in your face, as everything is to be done in person. But this is different. So it's kind of the start of the upheaval. As I mentioned, I apologize for any inaccuracies. As you can go a lot more in depth on these things. I'm just trying to give you an easy overview to make this make sense. So this is the deterioration of the system. Is now violence is part of the system. Violence against others in the political class. It deteriorates further under a general named Gaius Marius. Gaius Marius is what's known as a novus homo, or a new man. And he, I guess to back it up a little bit, the highest office in Rome is the consul. And there's two consuls because they didn't want one man to have power. So they'd serve together, and there would be two consuls at a time. When you had a consulship, you were supposed to have 10 years in between having your next one. It was to keep one person from having extended power. Marius breaks this, and he has 7 consulships in his lifetime. They were not 10 years apart. Many were protracted and put together and extended, and he justifies this by wars against a group called the Cimbri and a king called Jugurtha. He uses these as the two things to justify why this needs to be done. And this is a real deterioration now because, well, you know, you can break term limits, you can break agreements on what the actual political ascension looks like. He also makes major military reforms. The Roman military of Caesar and of the empire is a product of a lot of what Marius does. The eagle standard is actually something that comes from Marius. So then after that, we have a quaestor. A quaestor is someone that it's like a lower on the rung political office. He serves under Marius. His name is Lucius Cornelius Sulla. And if you have to find anyone in Roman history that is truly evil, Sulla is an evil guy. And he's largely responsible for actually ending the war against Jugurtha. But he feels slighted. His dignitas, or his dignity, is slighted. A triumphant general gets to celebrate what's called a triumph parade. You get to dress up as the god Jupiter for a day. You can bring all your troops within the city with you, which you typically couldn't bring troops under arms into the city, but for a triumphal parade, you could do that. Sulla ends the conflict against Jugurtha, but Marius celebrates the triumphal parade. This becomes a major slight for Sulla, and it becomes a real breaking point for these men. Now, there's a lot more to their civil war. You can go and look up more about this, but just understand this break between these two men happens. So what happens next? As I mentioned, a civil war happens between these two. It starts around, I think it's 88 BC. And Sulla is actually the first person to take his troops and turn them on the city of Rome. Marius flees the city, and there's a fighting across, Roman territory eventually for Sulla to try and find Marius, as he's also handling he's handling military action. I forget I believe it was against pirates that he was handling at this point. I'm trying to remember who he was actually fighting at this point. There's so many wars in Roman history. But the point of this is that Sulla then has a brutal process by the time he is dictator in 82 to 78 BC. So the office of dictator was supposed to last for 6 months because the Romans believed that one person could solve a situation faster than the two consuls you had, or the military tribunes, or whoever they may be. So one man would be in power, and it was supposed to last 6 months. If you've ever heard of the idea of Cincinnatus, he's supposed to be this Roman ideal that he lays down his power after 6 months and goes back to farming. Sulla breaks this idea of the Roman ideal, and his dictatorship lasts from 82 to 78 BC. So he's breaking now what a dictatorship is supposed to be and extending it into around 4 years. But there's also a brutal process that he starts during this called proscription. It starts, I believe, with about 80 names put on a tablet in the forum, and these are men to be killed. Their head is to be brought to Sulla to prove they're killed. But the next day, that list grows to 200. These lists continue to grow. There's actually an 18-year-old Julius Caesar that's added to this list for slighting Sulla, but because he had the right political connections, he's able to be removed from the list and back into Sulla's good graces. But Sulla is actually having people that opposed him killed. And the wild part about this, too, is you get names added to the list that shouldn't be there. names of people that were just upsetting other people around them. So this really creates upheaval in the city of Rome. And what would happen is if you wanted somebody's money, you could get them on this proscription list. You just add their name. If you had a slight against somebody, well, pretend there's somebody else in the list and bring their head in. So this created upheaval, it created uncertainty, and people were actually being killed in the city. Now, proscription is a really important point in history, and it creates a massive power vacuum. So what happens with that power vacuum, we're going to talk about in just a couple seconds. But first, I want to have a quick word for our sponsors.
The Wellness Company and their doctors are medical professionals you can trust. And their new medical emergency kits are the gold standard when it comes to keeping you safe and healthy. This medical emergency kit contains an assortment of life-saving medications, including ivermectin, Z-Pak. Rest assured, knowing that you have emergency antibiotics, antivirals, and antiparasitics on hand to help you and your family stay safe from whatever life throws at you next.
All right, so if you want to support the Wellness Company and help support this show, it is twc.health/JRS. That is twc.health/JRS. All right, so getting back to our story of a destabilized Roman Republic. As I mentioned, the empire I've been talking about a lot, and I do have another episode on that, which I'll link up in the description of this one if you want to get my full ideas on the empire. It's very interesting that these two things are happening at once because it is like civilization rocking. But getting back to our story of the destabilization of the Republic. So we mentioned the proscriptions of Sulla, the dictatorship of Sulla, which is 4 years, longer than the 6 months it's supposed to be. It creates a power vacuum. Things get a little bit better. The 70s BC aren't documented real well, but in 59 BC, Julius Caesar is elected consul. And when you're consul, you're in that office for a year. And also you're politically immune from prosecution. So you can't be held liable for what you do in that year. And I think the thing that's interesting, and this is what aligns really well with our system, as we're seeing the system breaks down, what starts to happen, we mentioned that consulships were being served more often. We had Marius served 7. We have the dictatorship is extending. We have violence has now become politically okay. We start to have this thing where law no longer matters. Only power matters. And these personal political squabbles are a huge problem. So Caesar's elected consul, and his main foe in the Senate is a man named Cato the Younger. The Cato family is very famous. Cato the Elder is very famous back in the days of the war against Carthage for saying Carthago delenda est, or Carthage must be destroyed at the end of every speech. So it's a very famous family. Cato the Younger is a lot less impressive than his famous ancestor, but he and Caesar are two guys that butt heads. They don't really get along. And the disagreement between the two of them is the major thing that's going to cause a lot of these issues towards the end of the Republic. And to now have this year of Caesar being consul, one of Cato's clients, I guess you could say in this case, Marcus Biblius, is the other consul in that year, right? So our two consuls are Caesar and Biblius. And Caesar is backed by a guy named Marcus Crassus, who is the richest man in Rome. A lot of the Senate actually owe money to this guy. And you could do a whole nother episode on Marcus Crassus. But what really happens is Caesar gets the support of Crassus and also Pompey the Great. And they have this private agreement called the First Triumvirate. And these two are able to create so much support that Marcus Biblius doesn't matter. And typically you would refer to that year, so the year of 59 BC, you'd refer to it by the year of those consuls. So it'd be the year of Caesar and Biblius. but often Romans refer to it as the consulship of Julius and Caesar, because Bibulus didn't matter, and basically this private agreement between Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey, called the First Triumvirate, is what's ruling Rome. So during that year, there's actually a lot of populist reforms that Caesar makes. The first is that he gets land for veterans and uses money that Pompey has brought in from his conquest of the East to give land to the veterans so they can start to farm and add something more than society after their military service is over. He does some other things for Crassus, which have to do with taxes in the East, because he wanted Crassus was a guy that always trying to make money off things that kind of seemed a little bit illegal. But the year ends, and Caesar then becomes what's called a proconsul. So this is a consul outside the city of Rome, because they would be serving typically in a military role to govern a territory or conquer something. So he's the proconsul for Gaul, and he serves for 9 years in this role. And after that time, he conquers a lot of Gaul. And this is where people say Caesar's a bit of a bad guy. What he did might have been bordering on genocide, but I think there's another thread I did, and maybe I'll do a future episode on. If you look at Caesar outside of what he did in Gaul, he's a man of his era, and he's not the evil guy people want to think he is. But anyway, so as I mentioned, Caesar has this personal gripe with this guy, Cato the Younger. And Cato the Younger blocks Caesar at every turn, creates a lot of issues for Caesar, and he was basically threatening, and this word had gotten to Caesar, to go after him for crimes committed during his consulship and his 9-year proconsulship in Gaul. And this is another issue that was happening in the late Republic, as we were now prosecuting people after their terms of service. Sounds rather similar to something we may be experiencing now, about a former president being charged with a felony. But anyway, and this is how a political system breaks down, right? The rule of law breaks down. The way things are done breaks down. But anyway, so Caesar, with his troops, is on his way back to Rome, and he wanted to celebrate a triumph. So he sat outside Italy with his troops and was told he was not going to be allowed to celebrate a triumph. And he would have to disband his troops and come back into the city, because he wants to run for another consulship. Because if he runs for another consulship, then he would be protected from these crimes, real or imagined, that Cato wants to charge him with. In Rome, you had to do politics in person. So he would have to leave his army and come into Rome. That would create a real issue for him if he has fear of Cato the Younger and a lot of what's happening there. All right, so now backing it up. So Caesar and his army are approaching Italy. He knows that if he disbands his army, well, he knows, first of all, he's not going to be allowed to celebrate a triumph, so he can't bring his troops into the city for that. If he disbands his army and enters Italy, there's a good chance he's going to be charged with crimes, real or imagined, for his time period. The northern barrier to Italian territory is this river called the Rubicon. And there's a lot of disagreement where this river may be or may not be, but anyway, it's the northern barrier. Caesar has about 10 legions during this time period. He leaves 9 of them behind the Rubicon, but he takes 1 legion, crosses the Rubicon, and this is where the idea of crossing the Rubicon comes in. It's the point of no return. And he makes the statement, the die is cast, because he's taking a really big gamble here. This could work out, or it might not work out. The Senate and Cato had given military power to Pompey, because Pompey and Caesar had fallen out in this time period. And Pompey is supposed to take a legion, but he didn't have enough military men ready to go yet. So upon hearing that Caesar crosses the Rubicon, Cato the Younger, Scipio, and Pompey all flee the city. So Caesar comes into Rome with his legions, and the rest is kind of history from there. Caesar then spends time chasing Pompey across the east. Pompey is eventually assassinated by the Ptolemaic king in Egypt. Scipio and Cato later commit suicide. And by 46 BC, Caesar is declared dictator by the Senate. We could go on and on about what this means for the rule of Caesar. I have other threads I've done on that, and maybe I'll do a future episode on that. But this starts kind of the end of what will be the Roman Republic, as Caesar's assassinated in 44 BC, 2 years later. We don't know if he planned to be a king. We don't know if he would have laid down his power. A lot of his reforms as a dictator were very populist reforms. As I said, there's a whole nother episode we can do on that. But this is basically what leads to the end of the Republic. And if you look at it now with what's happening against President Trump, prosecuted for crimes, which likely weren't real if you follow the whole story. And if they are real at all, they weren't. They're a misdemeanor. But they use the idea of this misdemeanor could be hiding a felony that you don't know about to be able to prosecute him. So we have the rule of law breaks down, a politician being prosecuted for things he did in his time as a politician. We've never had a former president charged. It's a really troubling time period to be in, because an empire, the empire fall, as I mentioned, there were main things causing that: crumbling central power, inflation, immigration. You solve that by handling the money. As I've mentioned, it's going to be bumpy if you do that, because you got to get us back on some sort of standard. Immigration, if you didn't come here legally, remove them. You can handle those things, as I said, not easily, but those are two things that are handleable. But when you look at how the Republic fell, and you look at how those things fell, I don't know that I have a right answer yet. Because the first thing Caesar does when he becomes dictator is he pardons his enemies. But that becomes a mistake, because his enemies will later assassinate him. So the clemency of Caesar leads to the death of Caesar. But now here's the other side of the coin. If President Trump is elected, despite these prosecutions, you could even call them persecutions, and he chooses to do the same thing to the Democratic Party, well, now the political system breaks down even further. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't argument. I don't have a good answer yet. I'd love to hear what you guys think about this. What do you think this says about where we're at in history, and how do we solve the Republic side of things? Because the Empire side of things, I don't know if our politicians would do it, but those things can be solved. The Republic side is a bit different, because there's this damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, and what it means for the future. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. As I said, I wanted to make it a conversation based on some things I had going on X. I've been trying to do some longer threads there to explain some things. The one that resulted in this episode is like 21 posts thread, so it's quite a long one. Took me an hour and a half to write. But I want to give you an idea of kind of where we're at in history and what it means for where we're at. I don't always have all the solutions, but as you know, I'm trying to work towards them and get us closer to them. So thanks again for hanging out today. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something, and I hope you're a bit more informed than before you got to this episode. Please share this one. This one is a vital episode, and please help me get this message out. Share this episode with your friends, with your family, with everybody you know, on every social platform. We need to get this out. Like this video, leave us a comment, smash that subscribe button. We support liberty, freedom. I want to build a better future. And I'll catch you guys next time.